All right, welcome back, everybody. I want to show you a few little tricks that you can do to essentially mod amps in the box in the AX8. So I really like doing this with the Marshall amps because there's, obviously this whole phenomena of modding Marshalls since basically the 70s, and I always think, personally, some of the greatest guitar tones ever recorded come from modded Marshalls. And one of the advantages in the AX8, we have so many advanced parameters that we can essentially take a stock amp model and do all of these famous modifications to them in the box, which is really cool, without having to risk, if this was a real amp, A, you'd have to really know what's going on with the circuit, and B, it can be quite dangerous, discharging, filter caps and stuff like that. You don't do it right, you can actually die modifying amps. So I'm much happier doing it this way. I'm on firmware 10 beta, the release candidate number 2, which you can get from the forum and try out for yourself. It sounds really, really good. At the moment, I'm using the new Plexi 2204 model with an impulse of my Marshall Tall Vintage cab with greenbacks. It is a mix of the top right speaker with an SM57 and a Royer 121. Actually, this is from a different cab. This is another cab with greenbacks, but I've used the top left speaker in that one. So it's kind of like a best of both worlds mix. And I have a little bit of the Studio C reverb on here with the mix at about 12% and the time turned down to 0.5. There's a pretty happening rock tone. I'm using my PRS, which has a Seymour Duncan JB in the bridge position. Sounds like this. And then on top of that, I like to add the Boss Super Overdrive. Basically, if I'm playing lead, I've been listening to heaps of Michael Schenker recently, so that's why I'm jamming on all the MSG stuff. So that essentially is my go-to kind of settings and the way I would set up, a real 2204 if I was lucky enough to get one, that is. But this style amp, that's how I like to set it up. Now, if we wanted to change that circuit in the real world, there are a couple of very popular mods. Probably the most famous or infamous one is the Jose mod, which basically adds a set of Zener diodes across the output section to a Marshall. So it lets you get this super saturated kind of gain sound. And the way we can do that here is this saturation section on the main thing. I like to use Ideal. There are certain amp models like the Friedmans which actually have a real deal saturation switch, but I like using Ideal because it's not going to change the volume. And then once you kick that in, you have this extra control to control the saturation drive. So let's just have a listen. And that to me gets you into that sort of 80s George Lynch sort of territory. It's a little bit fuzzy, but man, it feels so good to play. It adds this sort of like sticky compression to everything. Literally extra saturation, which is really cool. So that's one way to do it. My favorite trick though is if you go into the power amp section and you have a look at this master volume location, this is pretty cool because you can choose between a pre-phase inverter master volume, which is kind of stock in most Marshalls, or you can set it pre-triode, which to me doesn't make a huge difference, but changing it to post-phase inverter makes a huge difference. If you don't know what the phase inverter does in a tube amp, I'm not going to try and explain it here. I will link to some resources. I've actually found that on the Fractal forum, there's the whole tech notes section. So if you check out those tech notes, there's probably a section in there about this. But essentially what this is going to do is change the way the phase inverter section of the amplifier, which when it gets driven gives you, really contributes to that sort of classic sound of, Marshall amps and the whole like power amp distortion. You also have like this phase inverter section being pushed, which contributes to the overall sound. And just changing this also interacts with this negative feedback control and the presence control as well. So that whole sort of like power amp section of the amp, if you like, which is so critical to like, a classic Marshall sound. So let's just have a listen to what happens when we switch between them. You can hear immediately that kind of gets filthier and a little bit fizzier as well. But what this lets you do is it really sort of unleashes the master volume control there. I think with these amps, turning the master up sounds really good. However, when I do it and get to around 7 or 8, it kind of gets a bit too honky sounding. But I'm going to turn the master up to 7 with this post phase inverter master volume, and I think this sounds really good now. And that is, oh man, that's one of my favorite sounds out of this particular amp. So changing the master volume there, I think is super, super cool. It's not really a mod, but if you wanted to use different tubes in your real amp, you have to go and rebias it. We can choose between all these different tubes here. I am a big fan of chucking, where is the tube? The 6550. Yeah, into the Marshalls. Have a listen to this. Kind of just adds this really nice mid-range character to it. So there are a couple of my favorite mods. The other thing that you can do is play around with the negative feedback control if you want more low end. And you have to be careful with this because if you crank it too much, it gets way too muddy. But if you turn it up to about 3 or 4 on this particular amp, I think it sounds pretty good. Alrighty, that one is really cool as well. There is also this whole section, let me find it, I believe it is the speaker section, where we have transformer drive and transformer match, and these are going to change the properties of the virtual transformer in the amplifier. And anyone who knows anything about amps and has read, forums and the literature, you know how important like transformers are, right? When it comes to the overall sound of the amp. So what you can do with this transformer match is do a couple of things, but primarily you can sort of replicate impedance mismatch. If you were running like an 8 ohm amp load into a 16 ohm cab, that is going to sound different to, setting the amp to 16 and the cab to 16. And you can also do it the other way around, which in the real world, if you ran like a 16 ohm amp into like an 8 or a 4 ohm cabinet, you would probably blow it up. So turning the transformer match up or down just a little bit kind of makes a big difference in the overall tone. So let's have a listen to that. I'll go down and then I'll go up. which is pretty awesome. I like that, just a little bit, like kind of 10% either side. And again, you can kind of tweak this to where you like it. A few other simple little mod style things. You can change the supply sag, if you want more of a sort of classic driven thing, get this up to like 5 or something. Depending on how you want, if you want the amp to sort of feel a little bit looser, turn it up. If you want it tighter, turn it down, like this. I like it a little bit higher than stock. We'll leave it at 2. So that one's pretty cool. And then obviously you can change around stuff in the preamp section. There is this really cool section though in the dynamics, which is the, the character frequency. So I want to talk about this. And this isn't really something you could build into a real amp. I guess it's kind of like a slightly different section, but what this will let you do is have basically a dynamic EQ set to a certain frequency. For example, if I set it to around let's go 4,000 hertz, and I add a little bit of character to it, what's going to happen is that the harder I play, basically the more it will turn up this 4K kind of thing. So this is stock. So like just a little bit of character there, just adding some high mids in there. And combining all of these kind of tricks like I've done here. I've got the supply sag, different power tube type, different master volume location, and I will chuck on the saturation switch as well. You've transformed a kind of stock sounding Marshall amp into something completely different. Let's have a listen to that. And some of you might really like this and some of you might really hate this, but the idea is that you can customize it to what you do like. The other thing, really quickly, in the preamp section is, not in the preamp section, it's right here on the front thing, is you can change the value of the bright cap as well. So if you're finding you have too much sort of chirpy high end, you can turn the bright cap down or up if you want sort of more drive. This is sounding quite dark at the moment, so maybe I will double that value. And it sounds like this. And, you know, if you want to sound like Dokken, which I always want to sound like George Lynch from Dokken, chuck the rich hall reverb on, and this will kind of get you that, you know, tooth and nail kind of thing. I'll put this preset up if anybody's interested as well, so check this out. I love that. The reverb puts that sort of halo around it, and you can add, like maybe a 500 or 600 millisecond delay. Let's do 600 just because. I like to cut a little bit of the high end out of all of that with the digital delay, and basically crank it and play some Lynch stuff or some Rat or that whole era of classic modified Marshall tones. I will see you guys next time.